He sent for a gentle and affectionate woman, and 3 arrived. Robert Sampson looked at each of them with that seriousness of someone who takes everything literally. Let the days pass with the sluggishness of a man in no rush to fool himself, and returned the exact same answer to the matchmaker 3 times in a row. She was not the one. And then came the 4th. She arrived on a cold afternoon in November of 1928, with a suitcase smaller than the opinion she held about everything, with her hair escaping its bun since the 2nd mile of the dirt road, and with a letter for Mrs. Edith that stated, in no uncertain terms, that if the farmer expected a woman who would agree with everything he said, he had better look for someone else. Robert Sampson read that letter before meeting her in person. He stared at the paper for a long time, and for the first time in many months, he was not absolutely certain he knew what he was doing, but that part of the title you already know. What you do not know yet is what happened between her arrival and the day it became clear to both of them that neither had any intention of going anywhere. You do not know what Robert felt on the first night she stood on the porch after the rain, soaked to the sleeve, looking at the fields as if there was something extraordinary there that he had spent 6 years failing to see. You do not know what Celia thought when he stopped in the hallway mid-step just because she was reading aloud in a corner of the house, and her voice hung suspended in the air. You do not know about the conversation they had in the early hours of the morning, with the wind beating against the shutters, and the honesty of someone who has no energy left to hide anything. You do not know about the moment he almost sent her away and could not finish the sentence. You do not know about the moment she almost left and stood frozen halfway down the path without understanding what had stopped her. Nobody tells those parts, but I am going to tell you. Can you imagine a 37-year-old man, owner of a 200-acre farm, who convinced himself so thoroughly that he was fine on his own that he actually came to believe it? Who decided he could treat the problem of loneliness the exact same way he treated any other problem on the farm? Identify, hire, resolve? Robert Sampson thought he could. And perhaps it might have even been true if Celia Barnes had not arrived being exactly who she was, without disguise and without strategy, without the calculated politeness of someone trying to please him. She arrived being herself, and that was exactly what broke everything. This story took place in November of 1928, in the highlands of Silverfield County in rural Virginia, where winter arrived dry and the wind swept the fields before the sun could warm the day. It was a time when farms had their own laws, words carried more weight than any piece of paper, and love stories were rarely simple. This one was not. But it was true, and true, in the end, is the only kind that lasts. But before I continue, I want to know, where are you watching this video from right now? Write the name of your city here in the comments, because every day there are people from a different place here in this community, and I love knowing where each of you comes from. It does not need to be more than that. Just the name of the city already tells me a lot. Write it down there. I read all of them. And now, let me tell you this story from the beginning. Whitestone Farm sat 4 miles from the center of Silverfield, down a dirt road that turned to mud on the damp morning ground and to fine dust by noon. The name came from a rock formation at the highest point of the property, a block of pale stone that the late afternoon sun painted orange and pink before the night closed in. It was beautiful, with that effortless beauty that only the countryside understands. The kind of beauty that does not demand admiration, but lingers in the memory of anyone who stops to look a second longer. Robert Sampson inherited the farm from his father at 24, along with $3,000 in debt and the responsibility of 8 families of farmhands. In 13 years of restless work, he paid off every debt, grew the herd from 40 to 230 head of cattle, built a new barn, renovated the main house, and installed a water pump that supplied the entire property. The neighboring farmers respected him. The workers feared him a little and liked him quite a lot, that good combination that makes someone keep a job for years without feeling diminished. Robert had a routine he rarely deviated from. He woke up before the roosters, drank the black coffee that Martha the cook left ready, went out to inspect the cattle with Walter, the trusted foreman who had been on the farm since the first year, returned at noon for lunch, spent the afternoon going over the ledgers, ate an early dinner, and sat on the porch until the cold forced him inside. It was during this last part that the hired hands had learned not to interrupt him. There was a specific quality to his silence in those moments, a quiet weight that everyone noticed without being able to name it. Walter, a man of few words and profound observation, once told his wife that the boss's sorrow was not loud. It was like the bottom of the river, he said. You do not see it, but it is there. Teresa Sampson had died 6 years earlier, on a March afternoon that began like any other and ended in a way that took Robert a very long time to be able to recount without his voice faltering. A fever that arrived far too fast, consuming in 3 days what had taken years to build. She was 30 years old and laughed in a way that filled any room. Robert was 31, and that March he learned that some losses hold no consolation. They only demand adaptation. You adapt. You carry on. But the bedroom remains empty in a way that no furniture can fix. In the years that followed, the local widows showed up with visits and freshly baked pies. Mothers tried to introduce their daughters. Teresa's family pushed for a niece from Roanoke, whom Robert turned down with polite certainty and a firmness that left no room for insistence. Time passed, the attempts dwindled, and Silverfield slowly accepted Robert Sampson as the farmer who works alone and wants no one meddling in his life. And for a long time he agreed with that version of himself. There were small things that revealed what the years of solitude had done to him. The bedroom still had 2 nightstands, and the one on the left still held a candle that Martha replaced regularly because she had learned that the boss did not want to see the candlestick empty, even if the candle was never lit. The rocking chair on the porch had remained exactly where Teresa had placed it, tucked in the right corner, and in 6 years Robert had sat in it exactly 0 times, because there are things you keep not out of excessive grief, but because removing them feels like a declaration you are not yet ready to make. What he failed to realize was that the porch at night was not a rest. It was the only time of the day when he stopped being efficient and was simply left with himself, and that there was a very vast difference between choosing loneliness and being captured by it without noticing the exact moment the choice was made. Mrs. Edith Thornton lived in a house with green shutters in the middle of Silverfield's main street and was known for 3 things: the embroidery she sold at the market every other week, the rosary that never left her hand, and a peculiar gift for bringing together people no one would ever bet could understand each other. She did not call herself a matchmaker because she found the term far too commercial. She preferred to say she understood temperaments. She had brought together over 30 couples in 20 years of discreet operation and had been wrong in only 3 cases, a fact she acknowledged with the honesty of someone who knows perfection is not a human trait. Robert went to her on a morning in September, 2 months before everything happened. He went on foot, which was unusual because a horse tied in front of Mrs. Edith's house would tell stories all afternoon without needing to say a word. She received him without surprise. She poured coffee and waited with the patience of someone who has seen many people walk through the door without quite knowing what they came looking for. Robert stated, as directly as was his custom, that he was looking for a companion, a gentle and affectionate woman with whom it would be possible to build a life. She did not need to be too young or come from an important family. She needed to be honest, of good character, and the kind who would not mistake silence for coldness, because that was how he was, and he was not going to change. Mrs. Edith listened to everything and asked if he knew what he truly wanted, or if he was describing what he thought he ought to want. Robert said he did not understand the difference. Mrs. Edith said she did, but that for the time being it was fine because she had people in mind, and that he should be prepared for the possibility that what he asked for and what he needed were two distinct things that might or might not coincide in the same person. Out on the street, his back already turned, he did not see the slow smile Mrs. Edith let slip while she rolled the rosary between her fingers. It was the smile of someone who has just been handed a difficult puzzle and does not yet know the solution, but is already excited to try. The first woman arrived in October. Leonora Quinton was 31 years old, pretty with that polished beauty of someone who knows exactly the effect she causes. The right dress, her hair in the right place, her speech measured with an elegance that came from someone who had rehearsed enough to make the rehearsal look natural. After lunch, she made an insightful comment about the layout of the corrals that proved she had studied the property before arriving. That was exactly what bothered Robert, not the comment, which was intelligent, but the feeling that the entire conversation was a mutual appraisal, and that Leonora had already calculated the farm, the prospects, the owner's profile, and was deciding if the whole package was worth it. Perhaps it would even make for a reasonable and functional marriage. But there was something there that was not a conversation. It was a negotiation with a delayed effect. 2 days later, he sent word to Mrs. Edith she was not the one. Daisy Farley arrived in late October from Ashland, bearing letters of recommendation and a soft demeanor that disarmed any room she walked into. She had an easy and genuine laugh, and she agreed with everything, with absolutely everything, without exception, and without apparent effort, as if agreement were her natural state of existence. Robert noted that the winter was stretching on too long that year, and she agreed enthusiastically. He mentioned that the road to town needed urgent repairs, and she agreed with such a look of conviction that she seemed to have waited her whole life for that opportunity. On the evening of the third day, sitting on the porch, Robert realized he had spent the entire day talking, yet he had no idea what Daisy truly thought about absolutely anything, what she liked, what bothered her, what made her genuinely laugh. Martha was washing the last of the cups when he walked down the hallway. He said nothing, but the way he walked past, his head slightly bowed, hands in his pockets, was enough for Martha to know exactly how that story would end. The second message reached Mrs. Edith 2 days later. Rosemary Camp arrived a week later from Richmond, bringing an energy that walked through the door before she did. She was 35, widowed for 2 years, with the disposition of someone who had decided that sadness was optional. She talked about everything with a speed and a warmth that filled the room. Rosemary's enthusiasm was genuine, which made her more likable than anyone trying to fake such a thing. But there was a pattern Robert gradually identified. Whenever a silence fell between them, no matter how brief, she filled it, as if silence were an empty space that required immediate occupation. On the third afternoon, Robert stayed quiet for a long stretch after she finished a story. He waited. The silence lasted perhaps 5 or 6 seconds before she launched into another story, this time about a cousin who had bought an automobile and did not know how to drive it properly. What he needed, he realized with a clarity that surprised him, was not a woman who lacked her own heavy silences. He needed a woman who knew how to inhabit another person's silence without needing to fix it. The third message reached Mrs. Edith on a Wednesday morning. She took a long time to reply. Then she told her husband over dinner that Robert Sampson was the kind of man who did not know what he wanted, but recognized what he did not want with a precision she had never seen before, and that she had one last idea. One that might work, or it might explode. But there was no middle ground left. Celia Barnes was born in Lexington, up in the northern valleys, into a family of schoolteachers who treated knowledge as an inheritance more valuable than any land or livestock. Her father had taught arithmetic for over 30 years with the patience of a man who believes every stubborn mind is merely a door that has not yet found the right key. Her mother taught reading and sewing, claiming they were equally important because no woman should ever depend on anyone to interpret a contract or mend a hem. Celia had grown up surrounded by books and dinner-table debates, the kind of conversation that easily tipped into arguments because everyone had an opinion and no one had the patience to fake agreement. She was the middle of three sisters, a position that had made her a mediator by nature and stubborn by necessity, because in the middle you learn early on that whoever fails to stand their ground ends up vanishing between the ends of the table. She had been a teacher at a small rural schoolhouse for 6 years, and she took her work with the seriousness of someone who believes education is not a favor, but an obligation. She had learned from her very first year that to be respected by her students, she had to be fair above all else, because folks who work hard from a young age have an injustice detector calibrated with unforgiving precision. 3 years before Mrs. Edith's letter, Celia had been engaged to a man she loved with that quiet intensity that is the most honest kind of love. In October of 1925, he received a job offer in Chicago, offering a salary 5 times what he made in Lexington. There were 3 difficult conversations, then a decision made without her, then a letter that arrived on a November morning saying he loved her very much, but could not ask her to give up the life she had, that he wished her all the happiness in the world. Celia folded that letter with great care, the way one folds something fragile, and tucked it into a deep drawer she rarely opened. What remained after that was neither anger nor despair. It was a kind of redoubled attention to herself, a quiet resolution that she would build everything on her own from then on, and she had succeeded. But there was one thing she had not been able to replace with any well-crafted habit or routine: the specific feeling of being known by someone, not admired, not respected, known. That kind of knowing that only happens when you spend enough time with someone who pays attention to the parts of you that are not obvious. That was what 3 years of honest self-sufficiency had failed to compensate for. Mrs. Edith's letter arrived in mid-October, brought by a familiar traveling merchant. The handwriting was careful, the tone direct without being blunt. There was a widowed farmer in Silverfield of proven good character and stable standing who was looking for an honest companion to build a life with. Celia read it twice. Then she folded the letter and stared out the window for an amount of time she herself could not calculate. After 3 days of internal silence, she wrote back. She said she agreed to go meet the farmer, but she made it clear she promised nothing more than honesty, and that if the man expected a woman who would agree with everything he said, he had better look for someone else, because that was not who she was. Metzils, tut. Edith read the reply, smiled from the corner of her mouth in a way her husband called her checkmate smile, and wrote back that this was precisely why she had chosen her. The journey from Lexington to Silverfield took 2 days. Celia arrived in town on a Thursday afternoon in dusty clothes, her hair escaping its bun since the 2nd mile, wearing the expression of someone who has travelled a long way but is not tired with the sort of exhaustion that intimidates. Mrs. Edith took her home before sending her on to the farm, while Celia ate the warm biscuits and sharp cheese prepared by the matchmaker. The two spoke with the kind of frankness that holds the advantage of not wasting time. Mrs. Edith said Robert Sampson was a good man. She said this with the certainty of someone who had observed enough to need no qualifiers. A good man, but closed off, not in a mean way, closed like a door that has jammed over time. He needs patience, and someone who will not try to force it open. Celia asked if the other three had tried to force it. Mrs. Edith replied that the other three had tried to open the door by the doorknob, and that perhaps the door no longer had a doorknob. Perhaps it needed to be opened from another angle, or simply by someone who was not in such a rush to get inside. Celia thought about that while she finished her biscuit. Then she said she was not very good at picking locks. Mrs. Edith said she knew. That was exactly why she had called her. The next morning, on a November Friday, with a clear sky and the cold wind of the Virginia highlands, Celia headed to Whitestone Farm, sitting in a mule-drawn wagon guided by a silent farmhand who did not utter a single word during the 4 miles. She took the opportunity to look at the landscape, the open fields, the color of straw, the dogwood trees devoid of blooms, which in winter looked like beautiful skeletons, all bone and branch with the blue sky between them. When the farm appeared atop a slight rise, she stared at it for a moment. The main house was large, with white walls that time had turned the color of cream, boasting a porch that ran the entire length of the front. The trees in the yard were old and wide, and there were flowers in the front beds, yellow and orange, thriving despite the cold, which someone had planted with care and which someone continued to water with regularity. She thought it was beautiful. She did not want to feel too much before meeting the owner, but she found it beautiful in a way that required no analysis. Robert was out by the corral when the wagon arrived. He had already received 3 women in those past months, and had developed an odd combination of low expectations mixed with a hope he preferred not to examine too closely. He knew this was the last attempt he would make. Celia was stepping down from the wagon when he walked up, her suitcase already on the ground, her hair indeed escaping its bun. Robert Sampson was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of posture that comes from genuine labor, not vanity. His face was angular, his skin weathered by years of sun, and there was a seriousness to him that was not rudeness, yet was by no means an immediate invitation. He walked up to her, said good afternoon with the direct voice of a man who does not add words merely for the sake of politeness, and asked if the journey had been all right. Celia answered that it had been long, but that he did not need to worry about it, that she was fine, thank you. Martha welcomed her with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the boss's temperature, showed her the guest room with clean sheets and flowers in the vase, and asked if the young lady would like some coffee, or if she preferred to rest first. Celia said coffee sounded like an excellent idea. Robert stood still in the hallway for a second. The previous 3 had all asked to rest first, without exception. He was not quite sure what to do with a different answer. Over coffee, Robert laid out what the farm produced, the routine of each season. Celia listened with genuine attention, asked pertinent and specific questions, and at no point did she seem to be calculating the monetary value of the whole package. After a while, she asked what kind of flowers those were in the front beds. Yellow ones, she said. I saw them when I arrived. They look lovely in the winter, when everything else around is so dry. Robert paused for a second before answering. He said they were daisies, and that there were also some yellow dogwood saplings still small. He said Teresa had planted the daisies years ago, and he had kept up the habit of watering them because he was not quite sure why he should stop. It was the first honest thing he had said that day, without planning to say it. He only realized this afterward, when the ensuing silence revealed the weight of what had slipped out. Celia looked at him with an expression he could not categorize. It was not pity, it was not strategic curiosity. It was the kind of look from someone who heard something real and recognized it as such, without needing to do anything with it other than acknowledge it. She said she thought it was beautiful. Not the flowers, she specified with a naturalness completely devoid of affectation. The gesture of keeping them alive. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 10 seconds. For Robert, who had spent months enduring solitary silences that weighed like wet stone, It was the first silence in a very long time that did not need to be filled with anything. That night, sitting on the porch with the cold November wind against his face, he kept thinking about what had been different in that conversation. He could not pinpoint it accurately. There was something, but it was the kind of thing that slips away the moment you try to name it directly. Walter walked past the porch on his way to the barn and noticed that the boss did not have his eyes fixed on the horizon as usual. He was staring at the lit window of the guest room, where a shadow moved behind the white cotton curtain. Walter said nothing, but he walked back home with a step slightly lighter than usual. The first full day began before the sun warmed the air. Celia woke to the crowing of the roosters and the scent of coffee that Martha had already put on the stove. She got up, made the bed with the meticulous care of someone who had been taught that an unmade bed in the morning promises a disorganized day, and walked out to the porch before breakfast. The fields were still blanketed by the night's chill. The birds sang with the urgency of creatures with much to say. And out on the horizon, where the highlands met the sky in shades of greyish blue, there was a beauty she stood watching for a long stretch without trying to dissect it. Robert found her there when he came out for his morning rounds. They exchanged a dry, polite good morning, like two strangers who do not yet know they are going to become important to each other. He invited her to see the property during the morning. She accepted without exaggerated ceremony and walked out with him along the dirt paths with the open curiosity of someone who is not faking interest. But when they reached the stretch of road separating the western pastures, she stopped, looked at the deep rut the rain had carved in the middle of the path, and stated that it needed filling before the next rain made the section impassable. She said it with the natural tone of someone pointing out a fact, not asking for approval. Robert said he knew, that he had sent Walter to look at it last week. Celia remarked that Walter had looked, but looking was not the same thing as fixing it. There was a split second of silence that carried a different weight from the previous ones. Robert looked at her. She held his gaze without backing down and without apologizing for the observation. There was no insolence in it. It was simply her way, direct, unvarnished, lacking the excessive caution of someone afraid to displease. Robert said he would have it fixed that week. Celia said excellent and kept walking ahead through the pasture as if the conversation were the most natural thing in the world. Robert stood frozen for a second. He was not used to anyone pointing out something he had let slip without it sounding like an attack on his character. She had said it the way one notes a detail the other person might not have seen yet, with the simplicity of someone with no hidden agenda behind the remark. He walked after her, and realized, with a sort of quiet surprise, that the silence between them as they walked weighed absolutely nothing. In the days that followed, Robert began to notice Celia in the slow, involuntary way you notice a shift in temperature, unable to pinpoint the exact moment it happened, but knowing for certain that it is happening. She had a habit of asking about things with a genuine curiosity that made people want to answer far more than what was asked. Walter, who rarely spoke more than necessary, spent an entire afternoon explaining the farm's fencing system to her, then stood there with a bewildered smile on his face, like a man who had just realized he said more than he intended. Martha, who was a deeply private woman, told Celia on the second afternoon how she had arrived at the farm 15 years ago, emerging from the dense backwoods of the Blue Ridge Mountains with just 2 dresses and the courage of someone who has nothing left to lose but courage itself. And there was something else, a smaller thing, harder to describe. She laughed. Not the polite chuckle of someone being pleasant, but the laugh of someone who genuinely found something funny, bursting from her chest without warning. On the morning of the 4th day, Martha dropped the tin of cornmeal and stood in the middle of the white cloud that plumed up with an expression of catastrophe slightly out of proportion to the accident. Celia let out a laugh that echoed through the kitchen and helped Martha sweep without ever stopping her laughter, her hair dusted with white flour and her apron stained, and Martha gradually transitioned from a look of disaster to laughter as well. When Robert appeared at the kitchen door to investigate the noise, he found the two women laughing with flour all over the floor and the morning suspended in time. He stood watching for a second longer than he should have. Then he walked in, grabbed the broom from the corner, and began sweeping too, without saying a word. Celia looked at him with almost imperceptible surprise, then went back to laughing, now with something different in her laugh, something that included that man in the scene in a way neither of them had planned. Martha, after the two had left, crossed herself with a flour-covered thumb and went back to work. If you have made it this far in the story and still have not left your comment telling me where you are watching from, now is the time. Write the name of your city in the comments right now. It really helps the channel grow, and it makes me genuinely happy to know where each of you comes from. And now, let us continue. The rain arrived without warning on the evening of the 6th day. It came suddenly, that winter rain of the Virginia highlands that is more wind than water, but completely alters the way the air smells, bringing that scent of wet earth and damp leaves that has no exact name, but that everyone from the country recognizes with their eyes closed. Robert was wrapping up paperwork in the office when he heard the wind rattle the windows. He blew out the lantern, walked out into the hallway, and stopped. Celia was on the porch. She was not sheltered in the covered corner. She was standing right in the middle, where the fine rain blew sideways on the wind, her hands resting on the railing and her face tilted slightly upward toward the dark fields. She was not running inside. She did not wear an expression of distress. She was simply standing there, quiet, as if the rain were a presence she had unknowingly summoned. Robert stood motionless in the doorway for an amount of time he could not gauge. There was something in that scene he could not name, but which kept him rooted when he should have told her she was getting soaked and ought to come inside. After a while she spoke without turning around, as if she knew he was there. She said she loved the rain, that there was something in it that tidied everything up inside, as if the sound of water hitting the earth pushed all the crooked thoughts aside and left only what was essential. She said she knew she seemed crazy, standing out in the rain on purpose, but that she could not help herself. Robert kept looking at her for another second. Then he stepped out of the doorway, walked onto the porch, and stood right beside her with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the fields too. The rain battered his shoulders with the chill that a Highland November reserves for those without the good sense to stay indoors. He just stood there. The two remained in silence for a long time, watching the rain fall over the darkened land. The white stone up high vanished in the mist, the dogwood trees bending in the wind with the flexibility of those who have learned that bending is not the same as breaking. Celia said softly that the fields looked different in the rain, that they lost their dryness and took on a different color, richer, more alive, as if the rain revealed something the sun kept hidden. Robert stared at the fields. Then he said, his voice lower than usual, that it had been a very long time since he had looked at the fields at night. That for a long time the porch had been more of a habit than an actual presence. Celia turned her head toward him for a moment. She said nothing, but there was something in her eyes that understood what lay beneath those words, something that required no translation. They stayed in the rain until the wind died down and the shower turned into a fine drizzle. When they went inside, Martha was in the kitchen holding a blanket, wearing the expression of someone who is not going to ask, but who had watched the whole thing through the window for the entire half-hour. On the afternoon of the 8th day, Robert was walking down the hallway leading to the reading room and stopped mid-step. The reading room was a small space where Teresa had kept the books she brought with her trousseau, a shelf holding some 30 volumes that Robert had not touched since she died, but which he also had never removed. The door to the room was left open, carrying the scent of old paper, mingling with the smell of the wooden shelves. Celia was sitting on the wooden bench beneath the window with an open book in her lap, her hair down for the first time he had ever seen it. And she was reading aloud, not loud enough to be heard from far away, but in a low, continuous murmur, that way of reading some people have, of accompanying the words with their voice, so they settle better. Robert stopped and listened without her noticing. She was reading a passage about the ocean. Her voice carried a rhythm that matched the cadence of the sentences, with a precision that only comes from someone who genuinely loves what they are doing. That musicality that is not a performance but happens when someone is completely immersed in what they read. He stood listening for perhaps 2 minutes. Then she reached the end of a paragraph, turned the page, and noticed the shadow in the doorway. She looked up and met Robert wearing an expression he quickly tried to rearrange back into his usual seriousness, though he did not fully manage it in time. She was not embarrassed. She asked if he wanted to come in. Robert said no, he was just passing by, but he stood there for another second. Then he asked what she was reading. She showed him the cover, a book about travels across the American heartland. She said she had found it on the shelf, and if he did not mind, she had been reading it for an hour and could not put it down. Robert said he did not mind. He said that book had belonged to Teresa, that she loved travel books even though she had never left the state. He said this and then paused for a second as if he had not expected to say it. Celia held the book with a bit more care, as if she now understood the weight it carried. She said, if he preferred, she would put it back. He said no. He told her to keep reading. Then he walked away from the hallway, but he did not go straight to his office. He stood in the pantry for a while with his hand resting on the table, staring at the wall with a look that Martha, walking past with a dish towel, thought belonged to someone listening to something very far away or very deep inside. That evening, at dinner, Celia talked about the passage she had read. She recounted it with the same rhythm of her reading, vivid and precise, and Robert listened with his arms resting on the table and his plate in front of him without giving the plate much attention. When she finished, he remained silent for a second. Then he mentioned that there was a passage in that same book, somewhere near the middle, about the Mississippi River down south, which was one of the most beautiful things he had ever read. Celia paused. She looked at him with unfeigned surprise. She said she thought he did not read. Robert said he used to. He said he had stopped about 5 years ago, not for lack of desire, but because he had reached a point where reading alone in a low voice was no longer satisfying, and reading aloud with no one to hear felt more like loneliness than company. A silence fell after that which carried a different weight from all the previous silences. As if those words had accidentally opened something, a window that was not meant to be opened, but that the wind had pushed at just the right moment. Celia said slowly and without ceremony that tomorrow afternoon she could read the passage about the Mississippi River aloud if he wanted. Robert stared at her. Then he said yes. The following afternoon they spent almost 2 hours in the reading room. She read, and he listened, sitting on the bench near the window with his arms crossed over his chest at first, then leaning slightly forward, the kind of attention that grows without you realizing the exact moment it ceased to be politeness and became genuine interest. When she closed the book to rest her voice, the two of them looked out the window at the fields for a while without needing to say a word. The afternoon sun slanted through the thin glass pane, painting a strip of light on the wooden floor between them, and the air held the scent of old paper and the coffee Martha had left cooling on a tray by the door. Celia remarked that there was something in that book that made her want to see the American heartland for real, not through the eyes of a stranger, but with her own eyes. That she had spent 6 years teaching about rivers and distances and terrains she had never seen. Robert said the Mississippi was a 2-day journey by train from there if you went over the mountains. that he had gone once with his father when he was 12 and had stood on the banks for a length of time his father had called excessive, but that he had not been able to help himself, that there was something about grand rivers that felt different from everything else, a scale you cannot imagine until you witness it. Celia looked at him with that particular attentiveness of hers. She said she thought it was beautiful that he kept that memory like that, so clear and specific, after so many years. Robert went quiet. He was not used to people commenting on the things he kept to himself. He was not used to sharing things he guarded with people who had been there for less than 10 days. There was something in that conversation that felt different from any conversation he had had in a long time. Not bigger, not more intense, just more honest. For dinner that night, Martha had made fried chicken with okra and creamy corn grits, the kind of meal that in the rural South signifies welcoming before it signifies anything else. They ate with the tranquility of two people who have passed the point of needing to fill the table with unnecessary chatter. Robert asked for more grits. Celia asked Martha what she added to the okra that gave it such a rich texture. Martha, who stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel over her shoulder, offered a half smile and said it was a secret she would pass on in due time. The kind of answer that presupposes continuity, which none of the three commented on, but which all three heard clearly. Walter was the first to say something. It was on the morning of the 10th day, as the two men were riding back from inspecting the herd, and Robert had been quiet for most of the ride with a different kind of quiet, not the heavy silence of hard days, but the quiet of someone contemplating something that occupies the good space in their mind. Walter stated, without preamble, that the young lady knew how to listen. Robert stayed silent for a second. Then he agreed. Yes, she did. Walter noted that it was rare, that most people know how to listen just enough to reply, but to truly listen, the kind of listening that is in no rush to reach its own turn to speak, was something else entirely. He said Teresa had possessed that quality, and that after her, he believed the boss had given up searching. Robert halted his horse. He looked at Walter with an expression that could be interpreted in several ways, but the foreman knew him well enough to feel no fear. Walter added, in the voice of a man finishing one conversation and not starting another, that he meant nothing more than what he had just said. He spurred his horse and rode ahead. Robert sat motionless for a moment, gazing at the fields. Then he spurred his own horse and followed, and he spent the rest of the morning going over the ledgers with an attention that functioned properly but was divided with something lingering in the corner of his mind without asking permission. The late-night conversation took place on the 12th night. Neither had planned it. Robert had woken to the dogs barking, got up to check, found everything in order, and on his way back to his room walked past the parlour and saw light under the door. He knocked lightly. Celia told him to come in. She was sitting on the window seat with a wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders and a book in her lap. But the book was closed, and she was gazing out at the fields. The oil lamp cast a low, golden glow that made the room feel smaller and more intimate than it did by day. Robert asked if everything was all right. She said yes, that sometimes she woke up early and could not get back to sleep, an old habit. He said it was no trouble. He hovered in the doorway for a second, then, without much forethought, he stepped inside and sat in the chair near the table with the demeanor of someone passing through, but in no hurry to leave. They sat in silence for a while. The wind was still that night, and the fields outside were bathed in the cold brightness of the moon. There was only the occasional creak of the house's old timber settling into the cold. Celia said slowly that on nights like this she thought of her father, that her father had passed away 2 years ago, peacefully in his bed, and that she had been all right with it in a way that sometimes surprised her, because there was not exactly sadness. There was a longing that possessed the colour and shape of a present person, as if he were still somewhere close by, where she could not see him, but where she sometimes felt him. Robert shared that Teresa had been like that for him for a while, not in the way people say it as a consolation, but in the real way, where you are in the middle of a mundane task and suddenly possess the distinct certainty that there is someone else in the room. He said this faded over time, and that he was never sure if the fading was a good or a bad thing, because on one hand it brought relief, and on the other it cemented a more permanent absence. Celia explained that she had tried to store her grief the right way after her fiancé left, that she had learned grief does not require a wardrobe, you do not organize it into closed drawers. It simply grows smaller over time, for the pure fact that life continues, and you go along with it because you have no other honest choice. After a while, Robert admitted that he had spent 6 years calling that process routine, that he had gotten exceedingly good at calling it routine, at making the routine look sufficient, look like a choice, even look like a certain kind of virtue, that sometimes he wondered if he had confused endurance with strength for far too long. Celia looked at him. The lamp was turned low, but there was enough light to see the expression of a person sitting 6 feet away. She did not tell him he was right or wrong. She merely said, in a voice that was not meant to console but bordered on absolute honesty, that she believed endurance and strength were the exact same thing in the early years, and that the difference between them only becomes clear when you stop needing both at the same time. Robert watched her for a long time. The fields outside were painted blue by the moonlight, and there was in that room, in that midnight conversation neither of them had planned, something fundamentally different from anything that had existed in that house for the past 6 years, a lightness that was not superficial, an honesty that did not sting. When he stood to return to his room, he paused in the doorway for a second and said goodnight in a way slightly different from the polite goodnights of the previous days. With a voice pitched a tone lower and feeling closer than usual, Celia said goodnight as well, and when the door closed behind him, she stared at it for a long time before opening her book again. The first touch happened without either of them planning it, the way touches that truly matter always happen. It was the afternoon of the 15th day. Celia was helping Martha hang a lace cloth on the clothesline while Robert walked past on his way from the barn. The wind was blowing that afternoon, a brisk, biting wind that caught the fabric before Martha could pin the corner. Celia tried to grab one end, but the gust pulled in the opposite direction. She lost her footing on the loose stone step, and Robert, who was 3 strides away, instinctively reached out and caught her forearm before she could fall. It lasted a second, perhaps less. She regained her balance. The lace cloth ended up draped over Martha's shoulder, who stood laughing with it draped over her head, and everything returned to normal in an instant. But his hand had lingered on her forearm a split second longer than necessary to break the fall, and both of them realized it at the exact same moment, that extra second existing simply because neither had remembered to pull away in time. Robert let go. He took a step back. He said, in a voice a shade drier than the situation warranted, that she ought to be careful on that loose step. Celia said she would, thank you, and went back to helping Martha as if nothing had occurred. But it had, and they both knew it. Martha knew it too, because as Robert walked away, she looked at Celia out of the corner of her eye and said absolutely nothing, which was by far the most eloquent thing she could have done. That night, Robert stayed on the porch longer than usual. There was something different about the porch that night, something not found on the horizon, but residing within himself, a restlessness that was not exactly discomfort, but certainly was not peace. He knew what it was. There was something about that woman that slipped through the cracks without warning, and it did not frighten him the way it ought to. That was what made him restless. The fact that it did not scare him. Dun. On the morning of the 17th day, Robert made a decision that he subsequently spent an entire week trying to understand why he had made it. He called Celia into the office after breakfast and announced that he had thought long and hard and believed the arrangement was not working out as he had imagined. That she was a good person, that was undeniable, but he had asked Mrs. Edith for a gentle and affectionate companion, and while Celia was many things, she was not gentle and affectionate in the manner he had requested. Celia listened to him all the way to the end without interrupting. She remained silent for a moment. Then she stated, with a calmness that was almost disconcerting, that he was absolutely right. She was indeed not gentle and affectionate in the way most men demanded. That she possessed opinions and voiced them. That she disagreed when she disagreed. That she laughed when she found something funny and remained quiet when she wanted to be quiet, and she did not know how to be any other way. She continued, in the same even tone that held neither resignation nor confrontation, stating that if that was what he required, she would pack her suitcase that afternoon, and Walter could take her into town the following day. That she had promised nothing more than honesty, and this was her honesty. Robert stared at her for a duration that became far too long for a simple reply. There was something about her manner of speaking that unsettled him in a way he could not articulate. It was not defiance. It was a quiet dignity that demanded nothing from him but refused to yield. The posture of someone who knows exactly where she stands and will not pretend to stand elsewhere simply to appease someone else. He opened his mouth to say she could begin packing her suitcase. But what actually came out was that he was going to think about it a little more. Celia fell silent for a second, as if she had not anticipated that. Then she said very well, she would wait, and she walked out of the office with the same steady pace with which she had entered. Robert stood frozen behind his desk for a long while after she left, facing the office window that framed the yard, where Teresa's daisies swayed in the morning breeze. He'd managed to say everything he had rehearsed except the only part that actually mattered, and surely that had to mean something. Celia spent that afternoon packing her suitcase. Not because she had decided to leave, but because a packed suitcase was a way to gain clarity on what she was willing to do and what she was not. She folded her clothes with the mechanical care of someone whose mind is elsewhere. And the thing occupying her mind was this. She had arrived at that farm holding no expectations beyond honesty. She had delivered exactly what she promised. She had been herself, with a consistency that sometimes cost more effort than it appeared from the outside. And there was something about that closed-off, direct, complicated man that had captivated her in a way she had not foreseen and was not entirely pleased to admit. It was not the farm or the stability. It was something else. It was the way he had stood motionless, listening to her reading voice in the hallway. It was the fact that he had stood in the rain beside her without needing an invitation. It was what he had confessed in the middle of the night, slowly and without embellishment, about confusing endurance with strength for too long. They were doorknobs rusted not from malice, but from pure loneliness. But she had learned you cannot will someone toward you. That love was no landscape for the kind of effort she was willing to undertake alone. When she finished folding the final garment, she stared at the open suitcase for a while. Then she closed the lid without snapping the clasps shut. Not yet. That afternoon, Walter knocked on Robert's office door, holding the excuse of a ledger report that required a signature. He walked in, placed the paper on the desk, and waited. Robert signed it without reading it, which spoke volumes in itself. Walter retrieved the document, turned to leave, and then halted in the doorway for a second. He remarked, without turning around, that the young lady had stayed in her room all day, that Martha had taken up the afternoon coffee and sensed something in her demeanor that made Martha believe she was heartbroken, and Martha was not a woman who misjudged such things. He stepped out before Robert could reply. Robert stared at the closed door for a stretch of time. Then he rose from his desk, crossed the hallway, and walked to the guest room. He knocked. The suitcase sat on the bed, closed. She was sitting on the window bench, with her hands in her lap, gazing out at the fields with the eyes of someone weighing a decision without yet knowing which way it will fall. Robert looked at the closed suitcase. He looked at her, and he felt with a profound clarity he had not experienced in ages that he had reached the exact point where whatever choice he made would be the one that remained forever. He stated, his voice softer than he had intended, that he had thought about it, and he had come to the conclusion that he had asked Mrs. Edith for the wrong thing. Celia said nothing. She waited. Robert stepped fully into the room, stood in the center with his hands in his pockets, gazing down at the wooden floor planks, and admitted that he had asked for a gentle and affectionate woman because he believed that was what he required. But that he had spent the last 17 days realizing that what he had labeled as gentleness in the other 3 was, in truth, an absence, and what he had labeled as affection was merely compliance, and neither of those things had been what this house was lacking. He said what was lacking was someone who spoke her mind when she had a mind to speak, who stood out in the rain simply for the joy of it, who listened genuinely rather than out of sheer courtesy, who allowed a silence to just be a silence without fearing what it might conceal. He paused. His voice had grown raspy toward the end. He declared, looking her straight in the eyes for the first time in that room, that he wanted her to stay. Not like before, not as an applicant or an arrangement. He wanted her to stay because, and he stopped himself before finishing the sentence, because he did not know exactly how to finish it without making it sound vastly larger than what he knew how to sustain aloud. But that she understood. He believed she understood. Celia remained quiet for a moment that stretched just long enough for him to feel the heavy gravity of every ticking second. Then she replied, in a voice that was soft but concealed nothing, that she too was not entirely certain of what she was feeling, but she knew the suitcase was closed, not out of a desire to leave. Robert looked at her. Something shifted in his face, a small but undeniable fracture, like the very first sliver of light breaching a crack before a full dawn. She added that she would stay a little longer, that they would try, honestly. Without rushing and without any promise larger than what could be fulfilled day by day, Robert said that suited him perfectly. There was no dramatic embrace in that scene, nor any grandiose declaration. There were solely 2 adults with complicated histories looking at each other in a cold room with a suitcase on the bed and the fields outside beginning to succumb to dusk. And there was something passing between them that lacked a name as of yet, but which both recognized in the exact same manner one recognizes the arrival of the rain before the first drop ever falls. By the shifting scent and the change in the air, and the quiet certainty that something is about to begin. Before stepping out of the room, Robert lingered in the doorway. He mentioned, in a voice carrying that distinct pitch of a man making a monumental effort to voice something he would normally swallow forever, that it had been a very long time since he had felt there was anything worth rushing toward the following day, and that a few days ago he had begun to feel that way again. And he believed she ought to know. Celia held his gaze for a moment long enough to be completely honest. Then she replied, with the exact same simplicity with which she delivered everything, that she felt the same way. Robert nodded. He left. And the hallway, after he departed, possessed a wholly different quality than the hallway of before. Quieter in a way that was not empty, but rather brimming with something the 2 of them had accidentally left behind. In the days that followed, things began to shift in the way they do when 2 adults decide to make a genuine attempt. slowly, with stumbles, featuring better days and days where each person's old burdens resurfaced and had to be shouldered alone for a spell before they could be shared. There was a morning when Robert walked past the reading room and found Celia facing away from him, standing before the shelves, her hand resting lightly on the spine of a book she was not currently reading. She turned her head as she heard his footsteps, as if sensing his presence prior to any sound, and the two held each other's gaze for a second, with the ease of people who have discovered they no longer need to justify occupying the same room. She mentioned she was deciding what to read next. He stepped inside, stood beside her in front of the bookcase, and after a moment pointed to a dark-bound volume. He explained it was about the marshlands down south, that he had bought it on a trip to Richmond and had never opened it. Celia took the book, opened to the first page, and inhaled its scent, the way people who love books smell the ones they have yet to read. She then stated she would read that one, and that she would call him whenever she reached a good part. Robert replied that he would be waiting. That was the difference neither had given a name to, but both profoundly felt. There was a sequence now. One thing and then the other. There was a thread woven through the days that had never been there before. A remarkably thin thread, but one that refused to snap, connecting the morning to the afternoon and the afternoon to the evening in a manner that endowed the days with a quality entirely different from what they had possessed for years. There was more light inside that house. Martha hummed in the kitchen in the mornings with a regularity she had lost years ago. Walter came up earlier for his coffee and lingered for a second cup without citing any explicit reason beyond the fact that there was now more reason to stay. Robert gradually learned to let moments unfold without attempting to govern them with the stark efficiency he applied to everything else. He learned there was a vast difference between sitting on the porch alone and sitting on the porch with her, not because she filled the silence, but because she knew how to be present without demanding the silence transform into something else. Celia gradually learned that Robert amounted to far more than his outward severity, that there resided within him a generosity he did not know how to display, but which materialized in his gestures, in the way he checked if the oil lamp in her room had been refilled before nightfall. In the coffee, he asked Martha to have ready when she accompanied him on his morning rounds. In the book about the Appalachian ridges he brought back from a quick trip into town, and slipped onto the reading room shelf without a word, which she subsequently found with a piece of paper marking the chapter on the Shenandoah River. The piece of paper was blank, but it was not a blank paper with nothing to say. It was the blank paper of a man who had chosen to articulate through action what he could not manage to articulate with words. The month of April arrived, bringing the announcement that winter was drawing to a close. The small dogwood trees in the front beds, which Robert had planted 2 years prior, without ever witnessing them bloom, because the season always slipped past, unfurled 3 yellow blossoms on an April morning that Celia discovered before he did. She called out to him from the porch in a voice carrying a note of undisguised excitement, and he hurried over with the urgency of a man who does not know what has occurred, but fundamentally recognizes the tone. She was pointing at the dogwoods, wearing a smile that was neither elegant nor measured, the exact sort that breaks out when something small and beautiful reveals itself at precisely the right moment. Robert stared at the yellow blooms on the still slender branch of the young tree. He had planted those saplings 2 years ago on a winter afternoon for no particular reason he could articulate, solely because there was empty space in the flower bed and yellow felt like the correct color for that corner, and they had taken so long he had nearly given up waiting. Celia remarked, standing right beside him, that there was something profoundly beautiful about planting things that finally bloom long after you have stopped expecting them to. She spoke with the voice of someone delivering 2 distinct messages at the exact same time, knowing full well both are true. Robert kept his eyes on the flowers for another second. Then he turned his face toward her, bearing an expression entirely new to that face, discarding the customary seriousness and the cautious openness of the recent days, presenting something altogether simpler and far more direct. Something that was purely him, looking at her, entirely stripped of his armor. He confessed, his voice dropping lower than the bright morning sun necessitated, that there was something he had wanted to say for quite some time, and that he had spent far too long trying to unearth the proper way to say it. Celia fell completely still. The morning sun bathed the fields behind them, and the yellow blooms of the dogwood and her hair, which she wore down that morning, and the air carried that scent of warmed earth and spring blossoms that the rural Virginia highlands hoard for the moments that truly earn them. Robert admitted he did not fully understand what it was that existed between them, that he had spent his entire life being fiercely efficient with his words, and that for this specific matter, efficiency was utterly useless. But he knew that when she was absent from the fields in the morning, he succumbed to a different kind of quietness that was far from good. That he knew the reading room had acquired a meaning it never previously held. That the porch had taken on a thoroughly different meaning as well. That countless things within the farm and far beyond it had assumed different meanings over the last few months in a manner he had never asked for but was entirely unwilling to refuse. He paused. The breeze swept gently between them. He finally stated, with the simplicity of a man who had abandoned the search for the perfect phrase and opted instead for the honest one, that he wanted her to stay. Not just for a while longer, to stay for good. That he wanted to try building something undeniably real with her, armed with honesty and calm, exactly the way they both knew how to do, devoid of rush and entirely devoid of performance. Celia kept her eyes on his for a long moment. The sun beat down upon them, and the yellow dogwood flowers swayed in the light April breeze, and the scene possessed that rare quality of a moment that inherently knows it is a moment, demanding no record yet destined to embed itself effortlessly into memory. She said yes, with that identical, direct, unvarnished manner that characterized her approach to everything. She admitted she had waited for him to arrive at that point on his own because she believed it was crucial that he did, and that she had stood there with her heart in her throat at certain points, terrified he never would. Robert absorbed this and remained quiet for a second. Then he did something he himself had never foreseen. He smiled, not the polite smile reserved for negotiations. The smile of a man who genuinely felt something profound, a smile that broke crooked and imperfect and, for that exact reason, was the most beautiful of all. Celia gazed at that smile with a spark of genuine surprise blooming within her. The surprise of someone who always knew he was capable of it, yet had never calculated it would manifest like this, so strikingly different and so profoundly right. Walter, who happened to be crossing the yard at that very moment and politely pretended to see absolutely nothing, went home that afternoon and told his wife he reckoned everything was going to be all right around those parts. His wife did not bother asking what he had witnessed. She was deeply familiar with her husband's habit of saying precisely enough. If you are making it to this point in the story, I want to genuinely thank you for staying until the end. Now let me tell you how this story concluded, and how it begins anew. The marriage of Robert Sampson and Celia Barnes took place on a June morning in 1929 in a simple ceremony at the little church in Silverfield. Mrs. Edith had arrived half an hour early, clutching her rosary, wearing the expression of a woman who is not merely spectating, but actively harvesting the rewards of a job exceedingly well done. Celia wore a white linen dress her mother had mailed from Lexington, accompanied by a letter stating, in the family's tiny handwriting, that she needed to be happy now, that she had waited long enough. Robert wore the dark suit he had originally purchased for Teresa's funeral, a suit that had sat in the trunk for 6 years without ever finding another reason to be pulled out. There was an implication in that which gave him pause for a fleeting moment as he dressed, but which he subsequently understood in the way things clarify when you finally cease resisting, that the exact same clothes can signify entirely different things depending heavily on the day you wear them, that some stories do not merely end. They simply acquire brand new chapters that refuse to erase the previous ones, but instead exist entirely within their own right. Walter attended the ceremony with his wife and wept, a fact that thoroughly surprised everyone, most notably himself. Martha had stayed behind at the farm preparing the luncheon, and when the newlyweds arrived alongside their handful of guests, the table bowed under a quantity of food that blatantly revealed she had commenced cooking a full 2 days prior. Mrs. Edith sat beside Robert for a spell and whispered directly into his ear that she had warned him that what he asked for and what he required could very well be two drastically different things, and that she was immensely pleased to have been the person who assisted him in discovering that difference. Robert agreed, and he was secure enough to possess the grace to laugh at himself a little, which Mrs. Edith deemed the finest sign of all. The years that followed at Whitestone Farm were profoundly good years in the honest fashion that stands as the only kind that truly lasts. Not flawless, because flawless is a standard real life absolutely refuses to adopt, but brimming with that specific strain of wealth that never fits onto any ledger yet is instantly recognized in a shared glance at the close of a long day. Celia established a modest schoolhouse in the farm's side barn for the children and wives of the hired hands, outfitting it with wooden benches Robert commissioned without needing to be asked twice, and a blackboard he hauled back from Charlottesville, wrapped in heavy cloth as if it were a birthday gift, which in a certain sense it absolutely was. She taught reading, arithmetic, and writing, and in several instances, she instructed adults who had arrived knowing nothing and departed knowing, armed with that specific dignity belonging to those who have mastered something they will never again lose. Robert gradually loosened up over the passing months and years, not in the spectacular fashion of a man struck by a sudden revelation, but in the subtle, consistent manner of a man who yields inch by inch because whatever stands on the other side is entirely worth the yielding. He began laughing with vastly greater ease. He began recounting stories at the dinner table, a practice he had abandoned longer ago than he could actively recall. The porch at dusk ceased to be a solitary burden and transformed into a sanctuary for being together, quietly contemplating the exact same horizon. She still occasionally stood out in the pouring rain, purely on purpose. He still occasionally stood right beside her. Not every single time, but whenever he did, there existed in that act something the two had learned to intimately recognize without ever needing to name it, the mature, honest version of what those two individuals were capable of constructing together the moment they finally stopped being afraid. Mrs. Edith visited the farm in the autumn of 1932, 3 full years after the wedding, and stayed for Sunday supper. After scrutinizing the household with her highly trained eye, she mentioned to Robert, as he escorted her out to the motor car, that she had arranged a great many matches over her lifetime, and she knew exactly how to distinguish the ones that had succeeded completely from the ones that had succeeded merely on the surface. Robert asked what exactly she had witnessed that exposed the difference. Mrs. Edith stated it was the distinct way he had looked at Celia while she was conversing with Walter out in the yard, entirely unaware she was being watched, holding absolutely no reason to look at her in such a manner beyond the glaring fact that he was fundamentally incapable of doing otherwise. It was the exact same way, she elaborated, that people look at the things they fiercely know belong to them in a manner no piece of paper ever signs off on, yet remains vastly more definitive than any legally binding contract. Robert said nothing for a long second. Then he admitted that yes, she was entirely correct, Mrs. Edith drove away, clutching her rosary and bearing her checkmate smile, and Robert stood anchored at the farm's entrance, watching the vehicle shrink into the distance. Then he turned around. Celia sat on the porch with a book open in her lap, the wind catching her hair, looking back at him with that identical fierce attention that had been the very first thing he ever noticed about her, an attention that had not shifted an inch over the 3 years that had flown by. He walked back up to the porch. He sat down right beside her. She read a passage aloud without him ever needing to request it. He listened closely without her ever needing to glance up to verify if he was actually listening. The fields stretching out before them were cast in lush spring green, the dogwoods steadily growing less small, Teresa's daisies thriving in the left corner of the garden just as vibrantly as they had a decade ago, simply because someone had meticulously watered them every single day and would undeniably continue doing so. There resided a profound peace upon that porch, of a variety that is not the mere absence of hardship, but rather the heavy presence of something vastly larger than hardship, that specific strain of peace that does not stem from everything being perfectly resolved, but from knowing, with a certainty that thoroughly dismisses any need for review, that there is someone sitting beside you who will stubbornly continue to be there. The breeze rustled the leaves of the maturing dogwoods. The birds sang out with the frantic urgency of late afternoon, and the two of them remained on the porch until the lighting shifted and the land adopted that shade of antique gold that a Virginia evening manufactures. A color lacking any exact name, yet immediately memorized by anyone who has witnessed it even once, forever burned into their mind. And so it was, and so it remained forever. Robert Sampson had explicitly asked for a gentle and affectionate woman. He turned away 3. The 4th arrived carrying a suitcase vastly smaller than her opinions, and never once left, not because he had asked for her exactly, but because she had arrived being exactly herself, and that when all was said and done was immeasurably more than he had asked for, and exactly what he had needed all along. There was a crucial lesson tucked away there that Whitestone Farm preserved for many long years, baked into the white walls that time slowly tinted the color of cream, and deep within the dogwoods that grew until they finally cast genuine shade, upon the reading room's bookshelves that expanded with every trip into town, and inside the side barn schoolhouse that expanded right along with it, student by student, word by single word. The lesson was incredibly simple yet costly to learn, because the vast majority of people remain entirely unwilling to pay the toll it demands. That sometimes what you ask for and what you genuinely need are two drastically different things, and that the sheer difference between those two things might just be the exact opening through which love manages to enter. The rocking chair remained stationed on the porch for many years, and it eventually acquired 2 regular occupants, depending entirely on the day. Teresa's daisies continued to be watered, and as time marched on, Celia planted entirely different flowers right beside them, tiny, hardy roses of the variety that brave the bitter winter. And no one ever once debated the fact that the 2 gardens grew side by side without one ever harming the other. There was always ample room for both stories rooted in the exact same soil. There always would be. And Mrs. Edith, who lived to see 82, holding her rosary and retaining the sharp clarity of a woman who had spent an entire lifetime understanding human temperaments, used to declare in her twilight years, whenever anyone asked which match she harbored the most pride in, that it was that particular one out at Whitestone Farm. Not because it had been the easiest to arrange, she would state, but because it had been the absolute most honest. two grown adults who utterly refused to pretend to be someone they were not, who never promised anything they could not deliver, who simply arrived holding their messy histories in their hands and said yes, with absolutely everything they had and everything they were, and anchored themselves right there. That, she would say, slowly rolling the rosary beads with the tranquil calm of years of practice, that is exactly what real love looks like the moment you finally stop romanticizing it and actually begin to respect it.